Pine wood cracks. The dry report slams against the canyon wall like a gunshot across empty country. Then blood, dark red, running down into the half-frozen mud. No scream, only breath. And a shard of wood buried deep in flesh, 2 days' ride from the nearest town. Wyoming doesn't ask where you came from. It only asks how much you can take. High above, the mountains stand silent as a verdict. Snow begins to fall. Not the gentle snow of the east, but the kind that drives sideways, cold enough that skin forgets how to hurt. A man kneels down. One finger ends at the first knuckle. He doesn't tremble. He offers no words of comfort. He just draws the knife from his belt. "It'll hurt," he says. "I know what hurt is," she answers. He won't count to 3. They say he's lived alone on that mountain through 14 winters. No one knows why. No one dares to ask. He takes hold of the branch and pulls. The stagecoach didn't stop so much as it gave up. It lurched, shuddered, sank into the rust-colored mud of the way station like an old man finally sitting down after standing too long. The wheels didn't roll to a halt. They just stopped fighting. Willa Brandt had been fighting the bench seat for 6 hours. She was done fighting too. She stood up inside the coach before the driver called it, bent at the neck, because she always bent at the neck in enclosed spaces, in doorways, in other people's expectations, and pushed the door open herself. She stepped down. Her right boot disappeared into mud up to the ankle. She didn't stumble, didn't gasp, didn't reach for the door frame, like the 2 other women who'd ridden as far as Laramie, both of them dainty, both of them horrified, both of them already gone. People who stood 6'2" learned early that stumbling was a luxury they couldn't afford. You stumble, people laugh. You stumble at this size, people remember it. They tell the story at dinner. They describe the giant woman falling in the mud. They leave out everything else. So Willa didn't stumble. She just stood there, one boot in the mud, one boot still on the step. And she looked out at Wyoming. It looked back. The valley was the color of an old bruise, purple and gray, and that particular shade of nothing that happens when the sky can't decide between storm and mercy. Mountains ringed the whole basin like walls. Not the gentle, rolling hills of Massachusetts. Not the kind of landscape that had any interest in making you feel welcome. These mountains were a verdict. "You are small," they said. Willa almost laughed. She hadn't been called small since she was 9 years old, standing in the schoolyard while the other girls still came up to her collarbone. "Maud," she pulled her boot out of the mud. It made a sound like an argument ending badly. She stepped fully onto the ground. The mud accepted her. Both feet, up past the ankle now. Her wool coat, damp, heavy, smelling like a wet dog that had given up on dignity, pressed against her shoulders. She lifted her chin. The way station was a single room of rough-cut timber with a crooked stovepipe, leaning off the roof like a broken finger pointing at nothing. A hand-painted sign above the door read "Roos Cell, Stop." The lettering was thick and uneven, the kind made by someone who had learned to write late and never apologized for it. 2 mules were tied to the rail. A woman stood in the doorway, short, broad, somewhere in her 60s. Hair the color of iron. Apron that had been white once, probably during the previous decade. She was looking at Willa, the way most people looked at Willa. Starting at the boots, working up slowly, taking inventory, arriving at the face with an expression that was always some variation of "oh." But this woman's "oh" was different. It wasn't pity. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't the particular kind of cruelty that dressed itself up as concern. It was just honest surprise, and then something that looked almost like satisfaction. "You're bigger than he said," the woman called out. Willa stopped walking. "He described me? Said you were tall?" The woman stepped down off the porch, boots squelching, completely unbothered. "I told him tall could mean 5'8". He said he didn't think so." She stopped 2 feet away and looked up without a single trace of self-consciousness. "Dorothea Russell." "Everyone calls me Dot, Willa Brandt. I know who you are." Dot stuck out a hand. Her grip was a blacksmith's grip. "Come inside before you sink." The station's interior smelled of venison fat and coffee and pine resin, and the particular human warmth of a place that had kept people alive through multiple winters. A cast-iron stove squatted in the center of the room like it owned the place, because it did. A rough-hewn table, 4 mismatched chairs, a shelf of tin cups, and a Bible with a broken spine. Willa had to turn sideways to get through the interior door. She always had to turn sideways. She was used to it. She was used to the slight repositioning of her entire body that living in the world required. Chairs that didn't fit, beds too short, doorways too narrow, mirrors that cut off at her chin so she only ever saw herself in pieces. She sat down in the largest chair. It creaked under her but held. Dot put coffee in front of her without asking. Black, strong enough to strip paint. Willa drank it. He'll be here, Dot said, sitting across from her, wrapping both hands around her own cup. Grove runs late when the trail's bad. And the trail's been bad since Tuesday. Willa nodded. She'd gotten 2 letters from Grove Callum. 2 letters in the 6 weeks, between the newspaper advertisement and her departure from Boston. They were not love letters. They were not even particularly warm or thorough. A description of the land, the altitude, the winters, what the work required, what he could provide and what he couldn't. He'd asked her 4 questions. Can you work cold? Can you stomach blood? Can you follow instructions without needing them explained twice? Do you have any illnesses a doctor hasn't found yet? She'd answered, yes, 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 and not that I'm aware of. He'd written back within 10 days. The letter was 3 sentences. There's a coach Tuesday the 14th, from Denver to Laramie to Russell Stop. Ask for Dot. I'll come down from the mountain. That was all. No mention of the photograph she'd sent. No comment on her height, which she had not mentioned, and which the photograph, cut deliberately at the chest, had not revealed. She was not proud of that. She was not proud of it either. She'd spent $8 on the ticket. Her last $8. The money she'd been putting away in the tin behind the wash basin, at the boarding house, coin by coin for 2 years. She had not had a second option, which meant she had not had the luxury of full honesty. She could explain that to him. Later, when they had established that she was useful enough to keep. He's not a talker, Dot said, watching her. Neither am I. Dot's mouth curved, just slightly. Then you might do all right. The sound of the mules came first, that particular wet percussion of hooves in deep mud. Then the creak of leather and the single flat, tuneless click of a tongue against teeth. The sound of a man communicating with an animal in a language made entirely of habit. Willa set down her coffee cup. She stood up, because she always stood up. She had learned that sitting down when a man entered a room only delayed the moment of reckoning. Better to be standing, better to let the whole truth of her arrive at once, rather than in uncomfortable stages. The door opened. He had to duck, which surprised her. Because he wasn't tall, he ducked out of reflex. The way a man ducks when he's spent years on a mountain and knows that crossbeams exist and don't care about your skull. It wasn't about height. It was about habit. About moving through the world with caution built into your muscles. He stepped inside. Willa did the math automatically. She always did. He was shorter than her. 1 inch. Maybe an inch and a half. But the width of him. The sheer, almost geological density of his shoulders. He wore a buffalo coat that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original. Canvas trousers. Boots caked to the knee with red mud. His beard was a dark storm of black and silver that hid his jaw entirely. His eyes were gray, the flat particular gray of river rocks. And they did the same thing hers had done when she stepped off the coach. They started at the boots, worked up, arrived. He didn't say oh. He didn't say anything. Those gray eyes moved across her face with the unhurried efficiency of a man conducting an inventory. Shoulders, arms, the set of her jaw. And then, just for a fraction of a second, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like a man who has been handed a tool he ordered and is noting that it's slightly different than the catalog picture. Not worse. Different. "Grove Callum," he said. His voice was low. The kind of low that didn't get that way from volume. It got that way from years of not needing to be loud, because the mountains were quiet and he'd stopped trying to fill them. "Willa Brandt." He nodded. He looked at Dot. "Trail's passable. 2-hour window before the sleet comes back." Dot nodded. "Coffee?" He looked at Willa's trunk. It was a large trunk. It had taken 2 men at the Boston station to get it onto the coach. It was bound with leather straps and had a brass latch that had been soldered shut after the hinge broke somewhere outside of Kansas City. Grove walked to it, crouched down, took hold of the handle. He stood up. The trunk came with him. Onto one shoulder, his neck corded, his boots pressed deeper into the floorboards. But he didn't sway. He didn't stagger. He just stood there with 140 pounds of Willa's entire life balanced on his shoulder and turned toward the door. "There's a second mule outside," he said. "Can you mount without a step?" "Yes." "Skirts going to be a problem?" Willa thought about her wool skirt, her petticoat, her sensible cotton bloomers. She thought about what climbing a mountain in a blizzard was going to do to all of those things. She thought about pride and practicality, and which one she could afford. "I'll manage." He was already out the door. Pressed Willa's hand quickly, firmly, before she followed. Not a handshake. More like a person handing you something and hoping you hold on to it. "He's a good man," Dot said quietly. "He just doesn't know how to say it. Hasn't needed to say it in a long time." Willa nodded. She picked up her small carry bag and walked out into the cold. The second mule was mean, not aggressively mean. Not the theatrical, ear-pinned meanness of a horse with a grudge. This was the quiet, resigned meanness of an animal who had been asked too much for too long and had decided that cooperation was a thing it offered in extremely limited quantities. It looked at Willa. She looked at it. "This animal," she thought, "has my exact energy." Grove had lashed her trunk to the pack frame with hemp rope, his bare hands moving with the fast automatic efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. He didn't look at his fingers. His fingers just knew. She noticed the left hand, the index finger. It ended at the first knuckle. Not recently. The skin over the stump was old and smooth and entirely unbothered. He caught her looking. He didn't explain. She didn't ask. He grabbed the pack mule's lead and handed her the reins of the riding mule. "Rock there." He pointed to a large flat-topped stone near the rail. "Step up. Swing over. Don't side saddle." Willa hiked up her skirts, stepped onto the rock, and threw her leg over. The saddle was cold through her petticoats. The mule exhaled heavily, an expression of profound reluctance. She adjusted, settled, got her boots into the stirrups, which were too short by 3 inches but would have to do. Grove clicked his tongue. The mules began to move. He walked ahead, leading the pack animal on foot. He didn't offer her a hand, didn't look back to check if she was managing. He just started up the trail and expected her to follow, which she did, because what else was there to do? The trail disappeared almost immediately. What Grove called a trail was more accurately a suggestion. A series of places where the earth had been disturbed in a roughly upward direction, interspersed with rocks and pine roots and patches of ice, so thin they looked like nothing until your mule's hoof went through them, with a sound like breaking crockery. The trees closed in, ancient pines, enormous, their lower branches stripped bare, their tops lost in the gray sky. The wind moved through them not as a howl but as a long, sustained hiss, low, metallic, like something enormous breathing slowly through its teeth. The sleet started in 30 minutes. Grove had said 2 hours. The mountain had other ideas, tiny needles of ice, not falling, driving, horizontally. Into Willa's face, her hands, the exposed strip of neck between her collar and her hairline. She'd tucked her chin down as far as it would go. She kept her eyes on the narrow space between the ears of the mule. Her thighs burned. The mule was a barrel, a swaying, lurching, independently minded barrel, and keeping her seat required muscles she had not used since she'd helped her father. moved grain sacks at the mill when she was 16. She didn't complain. There was no one to complain to. Grove was 20 feet ahead, his broad back to her, moving with the mechanical steadiness of a man who had stopped arguing with weather a long time ago. The cold got serious around the second hour, not cold like Boston winters, not cold like something you could name and measure and compare to last year, cold like a physical fact. Like the mountain had decided on a temperature, and the concept of warmth was simply not part of the agreement. Her wool coat had been wet through for 40 minutes. Her fingers had stopped objecting and started going quiet, which was worse. She thought about Boston, about the boarding house on Tremont Street, about Galvin's Tuesday dinners, and the 7 other women who ate at that table. All of them smaller than Willa. All of them navigating the world through different sets of problems. She thought about the mill where she'd worked for 3 years, bending over the looms, the ceiling barely high enough to straighten. She thought about Ezra Farnsworth and his cold, evaluating eyes in the paper her parents had been so relieved to sign. She thought about the night she'd taken $8 from the tin behind the wash basin. She hadn't felt guilty. Not exactly. Guilt required you to believe that what you were leaving was rightfully yours to stay for. She'd felt only the particular, cold clarity of a woman who had looked in options and chosen the one that pointed in the least known direction. Wyoming had seemed like a direction. This mountain, this mule, this man with the missing fingertip. It still seemed like a direction. She just hadn't known the direction included this. Hold up, Grove said it without turning. Flat. Not loud, Willa's mule stopped. So did hers, because mules made those decisions together. She looked up, saw it. A lodgepole pine. Massive. Uprooted from the left side of the trail, and come down across it like a gate closing. Its root ball was a wall of torn earth and shattered rock 8 feet high. To the left, the root wall. To the right, the trail edge dropped off into a gray nothing. A canyon of fog and distance that made Willa's stomach turn if she looked directly at it. No way around, no way over. Grove tied both mules to a snag and walked to the trunk of the fallen tree. He planted his boots, he studied it. Trails too narrow to turn them, he said. Not to her, just out loud, thinking in the direction of the problem. We go back? Willa asked. No. He looked back at her. Those flat gray eyes. Need to move it. Shifted enough to push the mules under the root ball. There's a gap on the left side. She looked at the root ball. She looked at the tree. A pine that old, that big, probably weighed more than the coach she'd arrived on. That'll take both of us, she said. Yes, she was off the mule before he finished the syllable, because she didn't come to Wyoming to sit on a horse and watch a man solve problems. She came to be useful. That was the whole transaction. That was everything she had to offer. Usefulness, capacity, the ability to do things that needed doing. She waded into the mud beside the trunk. Grove pointed to a thick lateral branch, still attached, jutting out at hip height. Grab that. When I say pull, lean back. All your weight. Don't lift. Just fall backward and make it count. All right, he positioned himself at the main trunk, set his shoulder against it. His boots found purchase in the mud and rock. She watched him settle his weight. Watched the way his legs became part of the mountain. How his body stopped being human and started being structural. Pull. Willa grabbed the branch with both hands. The bark was wet and rough and tore at her palms immediately. She planted her boots. She didn't pull. She fell. She threw her weight backward and let gravity and 200 years of bone and muscle and determination do the work. The tree groaned. The root wall shivered. Dirt came down in sheets, a sound like the mountain disagreeing. Again. Harder she hauled. Her boots slid an inch in the mud. She caught herself, hauled again. Her shoulders screamed. Her lower back lit up in protest. She didn't stop. The trunk shifted. 6 inches, 8, a full foot. The root ball began to pivot, the gap on the left side opening like a slow, reluctant door. And then the branch she was holding, dead wood, hidden weakness, cracked. A single sharp detonation. Like a rifle shot in the cold air, the branch gave way under the torque. And Willa fell. She didn't fall far. She fell straight back, the way people fall when they're pulling hard. And the thing they're pulling suddenly isn't there anymore. Her boots went out from under her. The sky replaced the tree. She hit the mud and wet rock with the full length of her body. The breath left her. All of it. In one flat, brutal expulsion. She lay there for a half-second in the particular stunned silence of a body that has just asked for an immediate meeting with the ground. And then she heard it. Not pain. Not yet. A sound. A tearing. Wet and sharp and deeply. Fundamentally wrong. She looked down the broken end of the branch, still in her hands, still attached to the section that had whipped around when the tree shifted, had come with her when she fell. The jagged, split end was not in her hands anymore. It was in her thigh. The right thigh. Driven through her wool skirt and petticoat and into the meat of her outer leg like something that had always been looking for exactly that place. It didn't bleed immediately. It just sat there. A thick section of pine, the diameter of a broomstick, embedded in her leg. The brain does an interesting thing in that moment. It looks at the information. It processes the information. And then it very calmly says, "That should not be there." Grove was there. She hadn't seen him move. He was just there. On his knees in the mud beside her, his hands already moving. Not panicking. Not making the sounds people made when they were scared. His face was completely still, the way a doctor's face is still. Or a soldier's. "Don't move it," he said. He was looking at the branch, not at her. Assessing. "There's wood in my leg," Willa said. Her voice was very calm, which worried her slightly. Shock did that. Made things calm. Made everything feel like it was happening to someone standing slightly to the left of you. "I see it." He pulled a hunting knife from his belt. "I have to cut the fabric away. Going to look worse when I do? Do it." He sliced through her wool skirt and the petticoat beneath with 3 fast cuts, drawing the knife away from the wound each time, rolling the ruined fabric back. The cold air hit her exposed leg. She felt the temperature change against her skin like a slap. The branch entry point was ugly. Purple immediately. The skin around it already pulling dark. "The main piece has to come out now," Grove said. He gripped the branch at the base, right where it met her skin. "If it stays in while we climb, the muscle will close around it. Splinters will drive deeper. By the time I can work on it in the cabin, it'll be buried. Then take it out. It will hurt." Willa looked at him. Straight at those flat gray eyes. "I know what hurt is." He didn't wait. He didn't count to 3. He didn't warn her again. He pulled. The pain was white, not red, not hot, white. The specific total, obliterating white of a pain so complete it brieflakes the entire visual field. The scream that came out of Willa Brandt was not a woman's scream. It was not a dainty thing. It was the sound of a large body experiencing something large. It echoed off the canyon walls. The mule startled. The pines absorbed it. Blood came fast. Dark red. Pouring down her pale leg. Into the mud. Grove's bare hand came down on the wound. Hard. Pressing. "Breathe," he said. She was already breathing. Breathing very fast. Her hands had found the mud on either side of her and were pressing into it. Searching for something solid. "Deep breaths," he said. "In through the nose. You could have counted to 3, she said through clenched teeth. "Counting doesn't change what's coming." He pressed harder on the wound. His hand was soaked red. He didn't seem to notice. Or he noticed and had long ago categorized blood as information rather than emergency. Counting just makes you brace wrong. She didn't have an argument for that. She filed it away to be angry about later. He reached to his coat with his free hand. Pulled out a cotton handkerchief, gray but relatively clean, the clean of something that had been boiled and used and boiled again. He packed it directly against the wound. She made a sound. He absorbed the sound without comment. Then he uncoiled a length of rope from his belt, cut it and tied it tight around her thigh over the cloth. "Splinters," he said, his voice flat and direct. Wood got in there. I can feel them through the cloth. I can't get them out here. Need the cabin. Need light and heat and better tools. How far? Hour. Maybe less if you can stay on the mule. She looked at her leg, the rope tourniquet. The soaked handkerchief already darkening. She looked at the tree. The gap they'd made was just wide enough. Help me up, she said. He didn't say, are you sure? He didn't say we could wait. He put his hands under her arms and lifted, and she pushed with her good leg, and she was upright, the world tilted. She grabbed his shoulder. He didn't move. He was like grabbing a fence post. A fence post that smelled of wood smoke and wet leather, and something metallic that she would identify later as old blood. Other instances, other wounds. Other days when this man had bled without making a production of it. He walked her to thence on her waist and lifted her onto the saddle without asking permission and without any visible effort, which under other circumstances might have been interesting, and was now just practical. She gripped the saddle horn. He clicked his tongue. The mules moved. The next hour was an education in the specific flavor of pain that comes from a wound in the thigh during uphill movement on a swaying animal. Every step the mule took transmitted directly up Willa's leg, through the tourniquet, through the packed cloth, into the place where the branch had been, which was now a hot, pressing, wrong center of her existence. She focused on Grove's back. He walked ahead, steady, that metronomic pace. His boots found traction on wet stone where hers wouldn't have. He didn't speak. He didn't look back to check on her, which she understood, intellectually, was actually a kind of trust. He wasn't looking back because he calculated that she was capable of managing, and calling that into question with repeated checking would be a kind of insult. But emotionally she was alone on a mule in a blizzard in Wyoming. With a hole in her leg, the snow started properly around the 40th minute. Not sleet anymore. Heavy, wet flakes, the kind that settled and stayed. Her eyelashes, her shoulders, the nape of her neck where her collar had come open. Cold was a blessing. Numb was a blessing. The pain in her thigh was becoming a geography rather than a crisis. She could map its edges now. The sharp center and the radiating ache, and that made it something to manage rather than something being done to her. She stayed on the mule. The cabin was not visible until they were 10 feet from it. It had been built under the lip of a rock overhang, a shelf of granite jutting from the mountain's face, that protected it from the worst of the wind and sheeted water, away from the roof. The logs were massive, unpeeled, blackened with age and wood smoke. The roof had 2 feet of old snow on it. A stovepipe came out crooked and went up straight, which was the opposite of how most things were. One window, thick glass, iced over. Grove shouldered the plank door, open darkness. Cold that was different from outside cold. Static cold, trapped cold. Cold that had been sitting and settling for weeks. He got her off the mule, walked her inside. Set her on the narrow rope bed in the corner with the direct, transactional efficiency of someone completing a necessary task. The mattress was straw. It crunched under her weight. "Don't move," he said. He was already at the stove, kindling, something from a jug. Pungent, alcohol forward. A match, fire. The roar of it was the most honest sound she'd heard all day. He hung his coat, moved to the shelving along the far wall, with the fast certainty of a man who did not have to think about where things were in his own space. They were simply where they were. He pulled down a wooden box, a glass bottle of something amber, a jar of dark, dense substance, black-green thick. He brought them to the small table beside the bed. The lantern he'd lit cast long, jumping shadows across the ceiling. She could see the cabin clearly now. One room, the iron stove, dominant. Bundles of dried plants hanging from the rafters. Pelts, stiff and cured, nailed to the walls for insulation. Traps, tools, a rifle on pegs above the door. A shelf of books, 3 of them. Their spines so worn she couldn't read the titles from here. 3 books, she filed that away. "Give me your leg," Grove said. He was kneeling beside the bed. He'd removed his outer coat. in his thermal undershirt and canvas trousers. He looked different, not smaller. He never looked smaller, but more human. More like a person and less like a piece of the landscape. She shifted the leg toward him. He cut the tourniquet loose, peeled the handkerchief back. She looked. She couldn't not look. The wound was a thumb-sized puncture, ringed with bruising that had spread to the diameter of her fist. The bleeding had slowed. Not stopped. Dirty, he said. He was looking at it with no expression at all. Bark in there. Mud, he looked up at her. I'm going to clean it. All right, it will hurt more than the branch. She stared at him. Because this time you'll know it's coming, he said. It wasn't an apology. It was information. He poured the amber liquid. Whiskey. The smell hit her, over his knife blade, over his hands. He shook them out. Dry as he was going to get. Hold the bed frame, he said. She found the wooden frame above her head with both hands. Gripped it. He poured a measure of whiskey directly into the open wound. The sound that came out of her was not a scream. It was a single, compressed syllable of pure white noise. Her back arched, her hands clamped on the frame. And then his fingers were inside the wound, not delicate, precise. 2 fingers, moving with specific intent, searching the hot interior of the puncture, the way a carpenter searches for a nail head buried in wood. She felt the pressure of him moving inside her leg, and she wanted to crawl out of her own skin, and she didn't. She held the bed frame. She breathed. Splinters, he muttered. Got a big one, his thumb and the knife tip, working together. A tug. A different kind of pain. Extractive pain. The pain of something being removed from where the body had already started closing around it. He held up a 2-inch shard of wet pine. Dropped it on the floor. Another. He went back in. She pressed her lips together so hard. She tasted blood from the inside. She did not scream. Not this time. She made a sound that was private and ugly, and she had absolutely no control over it. A sustained low note of pain from somewhere below language. Last one, he said. She didn't answer. She was counting the knots in the ceiling timber. He withdrew. Set the knife on the table. Done? She asked. Her voice was stripped raw. Halfway, he opened the jar. The smell hit her before she saw what it was. A complex, aggressive smell. Rendered fat, sharp pine tar. Something bitter and herbal underneath. He stirred the black substance with a metal probe, turning it, coating it. Then he carried the probe to the stove and held it over the iron surface. The tar began to heat. She could see it from across the room. Could see the way it changed under heat, becoming more liquid, beginning to smoke. Tiny threads of vapor rising from the surface. He carried it back. He looked at her. He didn't explain, because she could see the explanation. The heat, the wound, the intention. She could see exactly what he planned to do. Pack the hot tar into the puncture. Use the heat to sterilize from the inside out. Seal it open, which was the important part. She understood that. You seal it closed and the rot happens below the skin. Invisible, catastrophic. Pack it so the wound healed from the deepest point upward. She'd heard of this. She'd heard of this and hadn't believed anyone actually did it. She pressed her back against the log wall, which was as far back as she could get. He stood there, holding the smoking tar probe, patient as stone, his gray eyes on hers. Wait, she said, the word came out cracked. Not her voice, someone else's voice. Someone smaller, you're putting that inside me? Have to. He didn't flinch away from the information, didn't soften it, wounds deep. Seal it on the outside now, the inside rots. Seen men lose legs to shallower cuts than this one. Tar keeps it open, draws the poison out. Heals from the inside, not the outside. She stared at the probe. At the thin ribbon of smoke rising from it. It will burn, she said. Like nothing else, he said. She looked at his hands. Both of them. The left one, with the missing fingertip. The scar she'd noticed on the inner forearm. Not a cut scar. Not the thin white line of a blade. Broader. Textured. The kind of scar that came from something packed into a wound. She looked at it. He saw her looking. Something moved through those flat gray eyes. Not quite discomfort. More like recognition. Who did it for you? she asked, a pause. Long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. I did, he said. She looked at him for a moment. At this man who had driven a hot tar probe into his own arm at some point in the past. Who had done that alone. On this mountain. And then apparently gotten up and continued being alive. She let go of the bed frame. She took 2 fistfuls of the straw mattress instead. Found the edges. Gripped, she turned her face to the ceiling. Found a knot in the timber. Fixed her eyes on it. Do it, she said. He drove the probe in. The heat was absolute. It was not pain the way she understood pain. It was conversion. It was the sensation of being changed at a molecular level. Her entire nervous system filed a formal complaint. Simultaneously, at full volume. The sound that came out of her started low and rose and kept rising. He put his forearm across her chest, not gently, with force, pinning her to the bed while his other hand worked, packing the hot tar into the puncture, thorough, direct, refusing to leave any part of the wound untreated. She clawed at his arm. Her nails scraped canvas. He didn't move. Breathe, he said. Breathe through it. Don't hold it in, she breathed. She breathed like something that had forgotten how and was learning again in real time. Loud, ragged. Ugly, keep going, he said. Don't stop. She didn't stop. The worst of it lasted perhaps 30 seconds. 30 seconds that were architecturally longer than any 30 seconds she had previously experienced. Then the absolute top of the pain, that white-out, converted place, began, very slowly, to resolve back into something she could categorize and endure. She stopped fighting. Her body went still. Not because she'd won, because she'd arrived on the other side of something. He removed his arm from her chest, slowly, checking. She lay there, her lungs working, her hair plastered to her forehead, sweat soaking through the collar of her dress. He wrapped clean linen around her thigh in firm, even passes, tied it off, stood up. He didn't walk away. He went to the chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out a wool blanket. Heavy, dark, smelling of cedar and old winter. He shook it out and laid it over her. The weight of it was immediate. The warmth of it hit her the way food hits after hunger, not gradually but all at once, like a door opening. He poured 2 inches of whiskey into a tin cup, held it to her lips. She drank. The burn of it was almost friendly. After what had just happened, she coughed. Turned her head. He set the cup down, pulled his 3-legged stool to the side of the bed and sat on it. His knees were close to the bed, his elbows on them, his hands, still blood-stained. She noticed both of them, hanging loosely. He was exhausted. She could see it now. Under the weathering, under the beard, under the absolute stillness he maintained as a default position. The lines around his eyes were deep in the lantern light. His jaw was set in a way that wasn't natural. It was held. The stove ticked. The wind pressed against the logs outside. Snow tapped the window glass like an inquiry. She looked at the ceiling. He looked at the stove. You've done this before, she said. Not the wound treatment. The other thing, the having Sumyon to care for. He didn't answer for a long time. No, he said finally. Not this. She looked at him. He didn't look back. You'll keep the leg, he said. Sleep. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. Not right away. She lay there in the dark behind her eyelids and listened to the fire in the wind and the occasional shift of his weight on the stool. She thought about the branch, about the white pain, about his forearm across her chest and his voice saying, breathe, like it was the only instruction that mattered. She thought about $8 and a train ticket pointed at a mountain. She thought about a man who had done this to himself once, alone, and hadn't made it a story, hadn't offered it as a credential. She'd had to see it to know. She thought about all the things she still didn't know about Grove Callum. The stove settled. The lantern burned down slightly. She was almost asleep when the fever started. She didn't recognize it at first. Just warmth. Reasonable warmth. Then too much warmth. Then the heat that didn't stop when she expected it to. Then the particular sensation of her own thought becoming slippery, of the edges of the cabin beginning to soften. She was in Boston, She was standing in the parlor of Mrs. Galvin's boarding house. The other women were there, small, bird-boned women, who moved through doorways without turning sideways, who could sit in any chair and not test its limits. "There she is," one of them said. Willa knew this voice. The voice of a woman named Patrice, who had worked at the glove factory and taken every opportunity to remind Willa that big women made men nervous. "Farnsworth will fix that," someone else said. "Farnsworth." Willa said the name out loud. In the cabin. In the dark, the sound of the stool shifting. She was back in the cabin. Partially. The fever in the cabin, overlapping the way dreams in rooms do in the half-awake state. Farnsworth, she heard herself say it again. A name she hadn't said aloud to anyone since she'd packed her trunk and walked out of Boston. She heard Grove shift. He didn't ask, he got up. She heard water, the tin bucket, the sound of a ladle. A damp cloth came to her forehead, not soft, efficient, pressing the heat back. Who is he? It wasn't a question, more like a file being opened. Kept open, she didn't answer. He didn't push. He wiped her face, her neck, her hands. Each pass of the cloth was the same, firm, thorough, impersonal. The specific impersonality of someone who has decided that a task matters, and the feelings around it can wait. "Sleep," he said again. The cloth stayed on her forehead. She went under, somewhere far away. Or, maybe right there in the dark of the cabin, she couldn't tell anymore. She heard him sit back down on the stool. Just sitting there. A man who hadn't wanted company for 14 years. Sitting there. Keeping watch. She didn't know what day it was when the fever broke. She'd stopped counting somewhere around day 2. When the ceiling had started moving, and the knots in the timber had begun to look like faces she recognized from Boston. Grove had kept counting. She could tell by the way he looked at her each morning. The specific, assessing look of a man who was tracking something and updating his estimate. By day 4, she understood later, he had already made his decision about what he would do if the tar didn't hold. She didn't ask what that decision was. Some information you accept without needing the details. The fever broke on the 4th day. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a flood of sweat or any of the theatrical signals that novels preferred. It just stopped. The way a storm stops sometimes, not with a final crash of thunder, but with a simple absence of rain. One moment the heat was there, pressing down on her from inside her own skull. The next moment it wasn't. Willa opened her eyes, the cabin sizzling. The same knots, the same timber. She was alive. She conducted a brief inventory. Thigh present, painful. But the pain had geography now, which was different from the fever's all-consuming fire. Head, clear, mouth terrible. Body weak in the specific, hollow way of someone who had spent 4 days burning through every reserve they possessed. She turned her head. Grove was at the workbench. He had his back to her. He was working on something. She could hear the slow, deliberate scrape of a file against metal. His shoulders moved with each pass. Steady, patient. A man who had learned to occupy time without fighting it. She watched him for a moment. He hadn't left. She didn't know why that surprised her. He'd made a transaction. A transaction required both parties to remain present. That was elementary. That was just the logic of commerce. But there was a difference between staying because you had to and staying the way he had stayed. She had fragments of the last 4 days. Impressions. His hands. The tin. Cup. The cold cloth. His voice saying, "Breathe like it," was the simplest instruction in the world. The weight of him on the stool in the dark, just. There she hadn't asked for any of that. He hadn't offered it. He'd just done it. The file stopped moving. He turned around. Those flat gray eyes moved to her face. Something shifted in them. Fast, brief, barely visible. Like a door opening half an inch and then almost immediately reconsidering. "Fever's broke," he said. "Yes? Water? Please." He picked up the tin dipper from the bucket beside the stove and brought it to her. Held it to her mouth without asking if she could manage herself. She drank the whole thing. Cold, clean, tasting faintly of iron from the bucket. It was the best thing she had ever consumed in her life. He refilled it. Set it on the table beside her. Leg, he said. Not a question, Hertz. But differently, he nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already calculated. He knelt beside the bed and began unwrapping the outer bandage. Peeled back the linen. She looked this time without flinching ugly. Yellow bruising spreading out from the puncture site, in a pattern like a map of somewhere inhospitable. The wound itself, packed, sealed with the dark residue of the tar. The skin around it no longer radiated heat. The angry red perimeter had faded. Not rotting, Grove said. He said it the way other men might say the harvest looks good or the river's running clean. Just fact. Just the world being what it was supposed to be. Tar held. You'll keep the leg. Good, she said. And then because she was not a woman who let debts sit unpaid. Thank you. He looked up at her. Brief. Then back at the wound, retying the bandage. Don't thank me yet, he said. You still have to walk on it. He made oats. Gray thick, utilitarian oats, with a handful of dried apple slices, reconstituted in hot water, and a pour of canned milk from a tin that had been sitting on the shelf for what looked like the better part of a season. He put the bowl in her hands without ceremony. She ate every bite. He ate standing at the stove, his bowl in one hand, not looking at her, not looking at her, just occupied, doing the thing in front of him. She watched his profile. He was not a handsome man in the way that word got used in the novels the women at the boarding house had passed around. No clean jaw, no romantic profile. His nose had been broken at least once, and hadn't been set particularly well. The beard hid everything else. His hands, wrapped around the bowl, were scarred and calloused, and the knuckles on the right hand had thickened from impact. Not all of it with wood, she suspected, but there was something in his face when he wasn't performing the act of being looked at. Something that was just. There, she didn't have a word for it. She filed it away and moved on. You slept, she said. Some. Where? He tilted his head toward the floor beside the stove. The canvas tarp folded against the wall. The single thin blanket beside it. She'd had the bed. All 4 days. He'd slept on the floor beside the stove in a canvas bedroll and hadn't mentioned it. That's ridiculous, she said. Floor's fine. You're 46 years old. He looked at her. A slight pause. You read my letter carefully. I read everything carefully. It's how I've stayed out of trouble. She paused. Mostly. He set his bowl down. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how's the leg really? It hurts. I told you the truth. Pain I can work with. Infection I can't. Then you'll be happy to know I feel less like I'm on fire and more like someone hit me repeatedly with a fence post. She adjusted against the mattress. Progress. Something moved in his expression. Fast. Gone. Was that almost a smile? No. Probably not. Probably just the light. The days organized themselves around necessity. Which was, Willa was discovering, the only way days organized themselves on a mountain in winter. Grove went out each morning before full light. Trap lines. Wood. The mules. He moved through the snow with the efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped experiencing weather as something that happened to him and started experiencing it as simply the conditions under which the work occurred. She couldn't go out. Not yet. The leg required elevation, required rest, required the very thing that Willa Brandt had the least tolerance for. Stillness. She took over everything she could reach from the bed or the stool. The mending pile. Enormous. A monument to deferred maintenance. Canvas that had torn and been roughly knotted. Wool socks with holes at the heel. A pair of trousers that had been patched over a patch, over another patch until the original fabric existed only as memory. She worked through it methodically, with thread and a needle she found in the wooden kit on the shelf. The root vegetables in the crate by the door. She sorted them from the stool, cutting away rot, setting the good flesh aside in the cast-iron pot with water and salt. The books on the shelf, 3 of them. She'd been right that the spines were too worn to read from a distance. She read them up close. A surveying manual from 1871, so marked up in pencil that the margins were fuller than the text. A collection of natural history observations, and, unexpected, tucked behind the other two as though it was slightly embarrassed to be there, a volume of poetry, Robert Browning. The pages of the poetry book were not marked up, they were just worn, read, multiple times. She held it for a moment. She put it back exactly where she'd found it. Grove came back at midday, boots off at the door, coat on the peg. He moved to the stove without looking at her, checking the pot she'd started. He stopped. "You sorted the turnips," he said. They were going soft on the left side. He looked at the pot, at the organized crate, at the mending folded on the table. He didn't say anything. He got a cup of coffee and sat at the table and picked up the mending and looked at it. "Even stitches," he said. "I worked in a textile mill for 3 years. She watched him. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation. In your vocabulary, is there a difference?" He set the mended sock down, looked at her, directly, the gray eyes doing that inventory thing again, but different this time. Not the assessing look from the way station. Something slightly more complicated. "No," he said finally. "Not much of one," she nodded. He drank his coffee. And somehow that was the most honest exchange she'd had in years. She learned things about him during those weeks. Not in the way people learned things about each other, through conversation, through observation, through the accumulation of small facts that built up the way sediment built up, slowly, invisibly, until one day you noticed the landscape had changed. She learned that Grove talked to the mules, not extensively, not with the full conversational investment some lonely people gave their animals. Just occasional observations, short, delivered in the same flat voice he used for everything. "Weather's turning. Go easy on the left side. You're in a mood today, aren't you?" The mules never answered. He never seemed to expect them to. She learned that he read. Not the surveying manual. That was reference, not reading. The Browning. She saw him with it twice. The first time he'd closed it immediately when he heard her move and replaced it on the shelf, with casual, unconvincing speed. The second time she'd pretended to be asleep, and he'd sat at the table for 40 minutes, in the lantern light with the book open, and his coffee going cold beside him. She didn't mention it. She filed it away next to the mules. She learned that he could hear things she couldn't. Some shift in the wind outside that meant nothing to her ears and sent him to the door to check the mule shelter. A sound in the snow load on the roof that made him get the shovel and go out before she'd registered anything at all. He listened to the mountain the way she'd learned to listen to the mill machines. For the deviation, the off note, the signal in the noise. He learned things about her too. She could see him incorporating information. The way she held a knife, the way she sorted without being asked to. The fact that she didn't like to be watched while she worked, but also didn't like silence that felt like absence. She needed to hear him moving somewhere in the cabin, some evidence of occupation, and when he'd been at the trap lines for too long and the cabin had gone too quiet, something in her chest tightened until she heard his boots on the step. She did not examine that too closely. The wedding happened on the 6th day, because the snow had been heavy for 3 days and showed no sign of reconsidering. And Wilhelm Grove looked at the window, and then at the calendar on the wall, a single page, hand-dated, tracking something she didn't yet understand, and said, "Storm's going to run another 2 days. Might as well get it done. Might as well get it done." She had imagined once, a long time ago and briefly, what a wedding might look like, not for herself specifically. Just, in the abstract, the flowers, the particular ceremony of being handed from one set of hands to another. She'd let go of that image at roughly the age of 14. Around the time it became clear that she was going to keep growing, and the world was going to keep being the size it was, but still might as well get it done. She got off the bed, grabbed her crutch, a Y-shaped birch branch Grove had cut and smoothed while she slept, placed without comment beside the bed 2 mornings ago. She stood up, the leg throbbed. She breathed through it. She managed her hair, which had not been properly tended in 6 days, and expressed strong opinions about that, and pinned it as flat as it would go with the 3 pins she'd found in her coat pocket. She was wearing Grove's old suspended trousers, rolled at the cuff, a dead trapper's flannel shirt, wide in the chest, which was, she had noted, the only shirt in the cabin that didn't look actively wrong on her proportions. Her wool skirt was a ruin from the branch. She hobbled to the table. Grove had placed the Bible in the center, open. He was standing across from it, hands at his sides. He'd brushed his beard, or at least, she thought he might have attempted something in that direction. His canvas shirt was cleaner than usual. Not clean, just less. He looked up when she got there. He looked at her for a moment. The whole of her, the trousers, the dead man's shirt, the pinned hair, the crutch, the 6 feet and 2 inches of Willa Brandt, slightly diminished by a week of fever and a hole in her leg and a mountain that had not been gentle with her. He didn't look away. "Ready," he said. Not a question. She gripped the table edge. "Ready." He looked at the Bible. He didn't find a passage. He didn't read scripture. He just opened it to a page that wasn't too water-damaged, and used it as a flat surface to look at while he spoke. "I, Grove Callum," he said. The gravel of his voice was lower than usual. "Deliberate, take you, Willa, to provide for. To keep from the cold and whatever else this mountain sends. Until one of us goes into the ground, simple, completely devoid of poetry, and somehow more binding than anything she'd heard in a church." She swallowed, her hands on the table edge, her knuckles showing. "I, Willa Brandt," she said. Her voice held. "Mostly take you, Grove, to keep your fire and work your land and stand my ground beside yours. Until the mountain takes one of us." He reached across the table, his right hand open, palm up, not the gesture of a man offering romance, the gesture of a man finalizing an agreement, the handshake of someone who meant what they'd said. She put her hand in his grip closed, warm, calloused. The missing fingertip, on the other hand, caught the lantern light as he gripped. His thumb pressed briefly against her knuckle. Once, like a period at the end of a sentence, they stood there. The wind pushed against the logs. The fire ticked. Snow pressed against the window glass. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He let her hand go slowly and picked up the Bible and wrapped it in oiled canvas and walked back to the trunk. She stood at the table, her hand still warm where his had been. She was a married woman. She looked at the man filing the rusted trap in the corner, absorbed entirely in the work. She looked at the fire. She thought, "This is the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. And then, I think I made the right choice, and then, I have absolutely no basis for that conclusion." And then she hobbled back to the stool and picked up the mending. Because the alternative was standing in the middle of a cabin, feeling things with no useful outlet for them, which was not, as a general policy, how she preferred to spend her time. The night of the wedding was the coldest night yet. She knew this not from a thermometer, there wasn't one, but from the sound the cabin made. The logs contracting, sharp cracks like rifle shots, moving through the walls as the temperature dropped. The stovepipe vibrating. The window glass, frosting so thickly that the ice was white, rather than clear by 9 o'clock. She was fully clothed under 3 blankets. Still shivering, she turned her head. Grove was on the floor, his canvas bedroll and the thin blanket and the buffalo hide he'd laid out near the door, giving her the space nearest the stove, which she'd understood as practical and had not examined too closely for other meanings. She could see his outline in the near dark. She could hear him, the clicking of teeth. Not continuous. He was trying to control it, the jaw clenching, the brief involuntary percussion of a body losing the battle against cold that it was too proud to admit. She listened for a moment. She calculated. "Julian," she said. The clicking stopped instantly. The outline went completely still. "Grove," she corrected herself. She hadn't known why she'd said the wrong name. His middle name was in the letter, buried in the practical information, one of the many things she'd filed away. "I can hear you." A long pause. "Floor's drafty," he said. "Flat. Unconvincing. The floor is frozen solid, and you are 2 degrees from losing feeling in your extremities. I've been colder, I don't doubt it. Get up anyway." Silence. Long silence. The kind where a man is having an argument with himself and losing. "Bed's not built for 2, he said. "I am aware." "I've been lying in it for a week." She pulled herself to the wall side. The movement sent a flare through her thigh. She absorbed it. "There is room if we do not move unnecessarily, and I would greatly prefer not to begin my marriage as a widow due to avoidable hypothermia." Another silence, then the sound of him moving, standing, gathering his blankets. She heard his boots on the floor. He'd kept them on, and then the rope frame creaked and sagged, and the whole structure tilted dramatically to the right as 200 and some pounds of Grove Callum arranged itself on the outside edge of the narrow bed. The mattress compressed, the ropes strained. Gravity, as promised, conspired immediately. The sag in the center pulled them both toward the middle, and she found his arm pressed against hers and his hip against her hip, within approximately 4 seconds of him lying down. They both stared at the ceiling, the temperature between them, the specific, shared temperature of 2 people, close enough to exchange heat, began almost immediately to equalize. The shivering in her shoulders started to ease. From beside her, almost imperceptibly, the tension in his frame was doing something similar. "All right," he said. "To the ceiling." "Yes," she said. "Also to the ceiling. Leg, fine. Don't touch it. Wasn't planning to." "Good." Silence. The fire ticked. The wind pressed. Snow on the roof makes a sound like sand shifting. She was very aware of him. Not in a way she knew how to categorize. Just his presence. The mass of him beside her. The fact that he smelled of wood smoke and leather and cold air. And now, close enough to notice something else. Something like pine pitch and coffee and thyme. He was real. That was the thing. He was very real, in a way that the idea of him, in 2 letters and an advertisement and a photograph of herself cut off at the chest, had not prepared her for. "Grove," she said. "The scar on your arm," she said it to the ceiling. Not an accusation, just the thing that had been waiting. "Who taught you the tar technique?" Silence. A longer silence this time. She waited. She was a patient woman. 3 years at the mill had given her that, if nothing else. "Nobody taught me," he said finally. "You said you did it yourself." "I did it." "When?" The fire settled. Outside, something in the pines shifted under snow weight. A soft, muffled concussion. "Cold Harbor," he said. "Virginia. June of '64. She knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Everyone who'd been alive in 1864 knew the name. 18,000 Union casualties in 2 days. The battle that had broken Grant's army's spirit even as they'd kept moving. The battle nobody talked about because there was nothing to say about it that didn't sound like the beginning of a very long silence. "You were there," she said. "I was there." She waited. "Lancer went into the arm," he said. "Side. The tricep. Missed the bone. I got separated. Don't matter how. Just happened. Things got chaotic fast. Found a stand of pines off the field. Stayed there 2 days." He stopped. She didn't push. "Wound kept opening," he said. "Every time I moved. Every time I tried to make it back toward our line. Packed it with mud first." A pause. "That made it worse. Then pine resin. A lot of it. Hot. I had a tinder box. It worked." Another pause. "Took 4 more days to find my unit. They thought I was dead." She processed this. "You were 26, she said. 26, he confirmed, alone in Virginia for 6 days with a lance wound, self-treating with tree sap. That is an accurate summary." She looked at the ceiling. "You could have died," she said. "Yes. But you didn't, no. Because you didn't want to." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower. Something in it that was not quite what it usually was. "I had land waiting," he said. "Staked it before I enlisted, came back to it." A pause. "Didn't want to leave it to someone who hadn't earned it." She thought about that. About a 26-year-old man in a pine forest, pressing hot resin into his own wound, because he had land waiting, because he had something to return to, because giving up was not an option when there was a thing worth keeping. She understood that in her bones. Not land. She didn't have land. But she understood the principle of the thing worth keeping, the thing you press the hot resin in for. She didn't say that. It was too soon for that kind of honesty. "Thank you," she said instead, "for telling me." He didn't respond, but he didn't move away either. They lay there, both of them very still. The fire burning down slowly, the cold held at bay by the slim margin of their shared warmth. Sometime in the night he shifted, rolled to his side, facing her back. He didn't put his arms around her, but the wall of his chest came against her shoulder blades, and his knees drew up behind hers, careful of the right leg, very deliberately, avoiding the bandaged thigh. She didn't move away. She closed her eyes. The storm raged outside. Inside, for the first time since the coach had dropped her in the mud, she was warm. Dot Russell came up on a Tuesday, 11 days after the wedding. The snow had eased enough for a single rider on the narrow trail, which Dot had apparently decided was invitation enough. She came in with frost in her hair, and a burlap sack of dried beans, and a tin of something labeled peaches that looked like it had survived multiple presidential administrations. "The leg," she said, looking at Willa before she'd even gotten her coat off. "Better, she's walking," Grove said from the workbench. "Not looking up, I can see that." Dot sat at the table and looked at Willa with the same direct, unsentimentally warm attention she'd had at the station. "You held up. I had competent care," Willa said. From the workbench, something that might have been the slight adjustment of a jaw, Dot opened the beans, started sorting them on the table with the ease of someone who always made herself useful in someone else's kitchen. "Had a man come through 2 days ago," Dot said. "Casual. Too casual. The particular casualness of someone about to say something that was not casual." Grove set down the file. "Silas Pruitt," Dot said. The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. Willa didn't know the name, but she knew the way Grove's spine changed. Not dramatically, he didn't tense visibly, but something organized itself in his posture. Something that had been at rest and was no longer. "What did he want?" Grove said. "Same thing he always wants." Dot kept sorting beans. "He had paperwork with him. Land office documentation. Says there's a question about the eastern boundary survey. Says the original homestead claim has irregularities." She paused, selecting beans with great focus, and he mentioned the marriage. Said a union witnessed only by the parties themselves, had no legal standing under territorial law. Willa looked at Grove. Grove looked at the workbench. "He's giving you 60 days, Dot said. "To do what?" Willa said. "To produce a proper witness to the marriage, or to have it re-solemnized before a licensed justice." Dot finally looked up. Her eyes moved between them. "Otherwise, Pruitt takes the question of the land boundary to the territory court. And with no family to support the homestead claim, he takes the land," Willa said. "He takes a piece of it. Enough to matter." Dot set down the beans. "He's done it before. To Ned Carrick, years back, before he lost the land. Ned was alone, no family, paperwork that wasn't in order. Pruitt found the edge of it and pulled." She looked at her hands. "Ned lost the east field. Went through the next winter without the fuel wood from that stand. The one after that without shelter enough. What happened to him?" Willa said. Dot was quiet for a moment. "He didn't make the third winter. The cabin was very still. Outside, wind moved through the pines. That low, sustained hiss, like something breathing slowly through its teeth." Willa looked at Grove. He was still looking at the workbench. His jaw was set in the way it set when he was holding something. Not anger. She'd catalogued his moods now without meaning to, the way you catalog weather in a place where weather matters. This wasn't anger. It was something older and heavier. "You knew Ned," she said to him. "He worked the east property line. 6 years. Grove picked up the file, set it down again. "Shared the fence repair? Good man. Didn't talk much." A pause. Pruitt was the reason. You know now, Willa said. He looked at her. Grove, she met his eyes. You know now, the gray eyes. Flat as river stone. Something behind them that she couldn't read yet. She was still learning the language of his silences. This one was weighted, dense, like a sentence with more words than he was ready to say. 60 days, he said. 60 days. Confirmed. He nodded once. Then he stood up, put his coat on, and went outside. She heard him for a long time after. The regular, heavy concussion of the mall on the woodpile. Steady. Metronomic. The sound of a man doing the only useful thing available to him, while he sorted through what he could not change and what he could. Dot watched Willa watching the door. He doesn't ask for help, Dot said quietly. I know. Never has I know. Willa looked at her hands, her calloused, ink-stained, needle-pricked, tar-marked hands. That's going to be a problem, Dot smiled. The first full, unguarded smile Willa had seen on her face. You know, she said, you're not what I expected either. What did you expect? Someone smaller. Dot picked up the beans again. In every way. That evening, after Dot had gone back down the trail with the last of the daylight, after the mules had been checked, and the fire banked and supper eaten in the usual quiet, Willa told him about Farnsworth. She said it without planning to, without building up to it. Just put it out there, the way you put a log on a fire, not gently, just. Down. I was supposed to marry a man named Ezra Farnsworth. Grove didn't turn around from the stove. I didn't run away, she said. I want to be clear about that. I left. There's a difference. Running away is when you don't have a choice. I had a choice. I chose to stop pretending the arrangement was acceptable. The coffee percolated. Small, steady bubbles. How old, he said. Still not turning. Farnsworth? 54. You? 22. She kept her hands on the mending. My parents had a debt. He owned the mill. The arrangement was, she searched for the word, convenient. For them, Grove turned around. He leaned against the stove, his arms folded across his chest, and you, he said, I was not part of the convenience. She looked at the mending, then at him. I took $8 from the savings pool at the boarding house. I put an IOU in the tin. I intend to repay it. A pause. I wrote to 12 men from the newspaper advertisements. Grove was the only one who asked practical questions. I wasn't advertising for romance, he said. I know. Neither was I. She set the mending down. But I want you to understand that I'm not hiding anything. The fever. I said Farnsworth's name. I saw that you heard it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight behind him, his face in shadow. Man like that, he said finally. Older, wealthy, owns what your family owes. Yes. You were right to leave. 3 words, 4 words, quiet, stated. No inflection of rescue, no dramatic weight. No, you poor woman, or how awful, or I can't imagine. Just you were right to leave. She felt something in her chest. Specific, like a window she'd been pressing against for a long time had simply opened. You were right to leave, he said again. That's all. She nodded. He pushed off the stove, walked to the table, set his coffee cup down and sat across from her. He picked up the piece of canvas she'd been working on. He looked at it. Left seam's pulling, he said. I know. The original thread was wrong for the weight. You fixed it? Just did. He turned the vest over, looked at the seam, nodded once, set it back down. They sat. The fire. The wind. The lamp. Pruitt, she said. Pruitt, he confirmed. Tell me about the land. He looked at her. If it's my land too, she said. I need to understand what we're protecting. Something in his face changed. Not softened exactly. More like a held thing eased. A fist not quite opening. Just less closed. He started talking. He talked about the eastern boundary. About the original survey markers and the spring that ran along the edge, and the timber stand of old-growth pine on the upper slope that Pruitt had been trying to find a claim to for 7 years. He talked about the homestead documentation, and where it was filed and what it said, and what the gap was that Pruitt had found. He talked about the neighboring sections, who held them, what the relationships were, where the trust was and where it wasn't. He talked for a long time. longer than she'd heard him talk before. About anything, she didn't interrupt. She asked 2 precise questions and let him answer them fully, and noted the answers in the margin of her mind with the same focus she'd given to the mill accounts, the only ledger work she'd ever been trusted with because her numbers were always right. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The witness problem," she said. "Dot can witness a resolemnization. She can, if we go down to her. Which means the trail. My leg can manage the trail, not yet." "In 2 weeks," he looked at her. "In 2 weeks," she said again. "Grove, I'm not made of paper." He held her gaze for a moment. "Testing something. Measuring." "2 weeks," he said. "2 weeks," she confirmed. He pushed back from the table, stood up, carried his cup to the stove, stood there with his back to her for a moment. "There's something else," he said. She waited. Ned Carrick. He kept his back to her. His voice was level, completely, deliberately level. "Before he died, he wrote me a letter. Sent it down with a passing trapper last winter." "What did it say?" "It said," he stopped, set the cup down. "It said Pruitt had forced him to sign over the eastern parcel through a piece of documentation that was falsified, that the boundary markers had been moved, that Pruitt had a man at the land office who adjusted the records." Willa sat very still. "He sent me the letter," Grove said, "and the original survey notes. His own copy. Where are they?" "Locked box. Under the floor. Far corner." She looked at the far corner. "At the floor, at the ordinary-looking planks." "Grove," she said slowly. "You've had evidence of fraud against Pruitt for a year." "Yes." "And you've been sitting on it." "Yes." "Why?" He turned around. The firelight hit his face directly. She could see the gray eyes clearly. And in them, for the first time, something that was not flat. Something that had depth and weight and the specific, tired look of something carried for too long. "Because Ned's gone," he said. "And I didn't know if the evidence was enough without him. And because—" He stopped. "Because I had no one to stand beside me when I made the accusation." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire. The wind. 2 people in a 1-room cabin on a Wyoming mountain. Married on the 6th day. Sharing a bed for warmth. 60 days on a clock that Silas Pruitt had set. "You have someone now," Willa said. The words were very quiet. He held her gaze. "And something. Something that had no name yet. Something that was not romance, and not sentiment, and not any of the categories she dismissed long ago as irrelevant to her circumstances, moved through the space between them like heat through a cold room. Slow, deliberate, entirely inevitable." He nodded. "Once, get some sleep," he said. "Leg needs rest if you're walking in 2 weeks." He turned back to the stove. She picked up the mending. Outside, the wind pressed against the logs. The snow settled on the roof. The mountain breathed its long, slow breath, but inside was warm. After Dot had gone back down the trail, Grove pulled up the loose floor plank in the far corner. She had known it was there. He'd told her. But seeing it was different. The box underneath was iron. Small. Locked with a mechanism that had rusted slightly at the edges from years of cold and damp. He opened it with a key from his pocket. He set the contents on the table. 2 items. A folded letter. The paper soft with handling, the kind of soft that comes from being read and reread over a long time. And beneath it, a set of survey notes. Hand-drawn. Precise. The careful work of a man who understood that precision was the only protection he had. Ned Carrick's handwriting. She could tell without being told. The letters of a man who had learned to write as an adult. Deliberate. Slightly large. Each one placed with intention. She picked up the survey notes first. She read them slowly. Then the letter. When she finished, she set both down on the table. She pressed her palms flat on the surface. She looked at the marks Ned had made. The boundary lines, the spring, the timber stand, the careful notation of distances and landmarks that a man had recorded because he understood on some level that he might need someone else to understand them later. He had been right, he just hadn't lived long enough to know it. "The survey ordinance he's using," she said. She kept her voice level. The 1871 reference. Is there a copy of the surveying manual on your shelf? Top shelf. Behind the natural history, she found it. She brought it to the table. She sat down and opened it and began to read. Grove watched her for a moment. Then he picked up the file and went back to the trap. The lantern burned between them. Outside, the snow had started again. The quiet, purposeful snow of a mountain that had not finished with winter yet. But inside, the stove held. The fire held. She read for 2 hours. She found what she was looking for on page 41. She didn't say anything immediately. She marked the page with a strip of leather cut from a scrap on the shelf. She closed the manual. She looked at Ned's survey notes again, at his boundary lines. At the spring he'd marked with a small, careful X. Grove, she said. He set the file down. When we go to Cheyenne, she said. I know what to say. He looked at her across the room. The flat gray eyes. Something in them that was not quite relief. More like the specific expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been told he doesn't have to carry it the same way anymore. He nodded once. 2 weeks, he said. Then we go down. 2 weeks, she said. She closed the manual. She put Ned's letter back in the iron box. Carefully. The way you handle something that belongs to a person who is no longer there to handle it themselves. Grove locked the box. Put it back under the floor. Replaced the plank. They didn't speak again that evening. But the silence was different from the silences before. It had direction now. Spring came to the mountain the way truth comes to people who have been avoiding it, all at once, unavoidable, and somehow still a surprise. One morning, the snow on the south-facing slope was 4 feet deep and permanent, and had been permanent since October, and would apparently always be permanent forever. The next morning it was running, thin silver threads at first, then rivulets, then a genuine, muscular conversation of meltwater cutting new channels down the rock face, undermining the snowpack, pulling the whole white weight of winter off the mountain, like a cloth being drawn from a table. The air changed. That was the first thing. It lost its knife edge. Still cold. Still cold enough that Willa's breath misted when she stepped onto the porch in the early morning. But the cold had changed character. It was no longer a threat. It was just a temperature. She stood on the porch every morning now, because she could. She'd been standing on the porch every morning for 11 days, since the day the leg had finally decided to accept weight without, filing a formal protest with every step. The wound had closed 3 weeks earlier. Closed from the inside out, exactly the way Grove had said it would when he packed it with pine tar and held her down while she screamed. She still walked with a limp. She was going to walk with a limp for the rest of her life. The muscle had knitted wrong. Or rather, it had knitted correctly, but with a permanent alteration in the architecture. Her right leg was slightly shorter in its movement than her left. Not in length, in range, in what it would agree to do at speed. She had spent approximately 4 hours being upset about this. Then she had decided that a woman who had been offered a life where the worst outcome was a limp did not have the luxury of sustained self-pity about the limp. So she walked every morning the length of the cabin, the porch, the yard where the woodpile lived. Back. She added distance each day. She didn't ask Grove if she was pushing too fast. He watched her the first 2 mornings and said nothing. And she took his silence as the assessment of a practical man who would speak if there were a problem. There was no problem, the leg held. On the morning of day 43, she was ready. She knew it the way she knew when a wound had crossed from healing into healed. Not a dramatic moment. Just a morning when she stood on the porch and put her full weight on the right leg, and the leg simply held. No negotiation. No protest filed with management. Just held. She went back inside. Grove was at the table with the iron box open in front of him. He had Ned's letter in one hand and the surveying manual in the other. He was cross-referencing. Checking her work from 2 weeks ago, she understood. Without saying that was what he was doing, she put on the canvas duster. He looked up, "Ready," she said. He closed the manual. He folded Ned's letter back into the envelope. He put both in his coat. He stood up. "Trail's passable," he said. "2 days to Cheyenne if we push, then we push," she said. He looked at her for a moment. At the coat, at her leg. At her face he nodded. They went down. The way station appeared below them around midday. The Russell stop sign crooked as ever, the stovepipe leaning, the smell of Dot's coffee, reaching them while they were still 20 yards out. Dot was on the porch when they came into the yard. She looked at them both. At the way they moved together. At Willa's walking staff and her limp and the set of her shoulders. "You're going to Cheyenne?" Dot said. "We're going to Cheyenne," Willa said. Dot nodded. She went inside. She came back out with a package wrapped in brown paper and twine. She held it out to Willa. Willa looked at it. She looked at Dot. "Grove asked me to hold it for him," Dot said. "About 2 months ago. Before you arrived, Willa took it. The paper was stiff. The package was heavy. The twine was a double knot. The practical double knot of someone who intended whatever was inside to be protected." She pulled the twine loose, tore back the paper. Inside was a coat, not a lady's riding coat, not a fashionable traveling coat, not the kind of garment designed to make a woman look presentable and modest and suitably feminine in polite company. Cathagasset dark olive green, heavy as iron, lined with dense unbleached sheepskin, brass buttons, large ones, the kind that didn't pop loose when you caught a doorframe. Deep pockets reinforced with leather at the seams. A collar wide enough to fold up over her jaw in wind. And the sleeves. The sleeves were long. She turned one back, looked at the length of it. Long enough for arms like hers. Long enough for a woman with a 6'2" reach, who had spent her whole life wearing coats that ended at the forearm because the pattern had been made for someone else. She stood in the yard of Russell Stop and looked at this coat. She had not cried through the pine branch. Had not cried through the pine tar. Had not cried through 4 days of fever, an improvised wedding, a legal threat, or a winter with 30 below zero, and 2 bodies in a bed built for one. She was not going to cry now. She was absolutely, categorically not going to cry over a coat. She looked at Grove. He was watching her, arms crossed, face neutral. In the specific way his face went neutral, when he was paying very close attention to something, and didn't want that to be obvious. "You ordered this before I arrived," she said. 8 weeks before, he said it simply. "Sent the measurements to a tailor in Cheyenne, with a freight driver. Gave him your height from the letter. Told him to build the sleeves long, and the shoulders wide and the lining dense." A pause. "Told him it had to hold up to work. You knew I'd be staying. I knew you'd need a coat that fit." She looked at him. He looked at her. "That's not the same thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She buttoned the last brass button. She looked at him. He looked at her coat. "Cheyenne," he said. "Cheyenne," she said. Dot was looking at the sky with great interest, as if it had become suddenly fascinating. "I'll write you a letter," Dot said to the sky, "about what I've seen at this station. Travelers. Settlers. What I've watched Pruitt do to people on their way through." She paused. "It won't be legal testimony, but it'll be the truth, and the truth has a way of making rooms uncomfortable." Dot, Willa said. The older woman looked at her. "Thank you," Willa said. Dot made a sound. A dismissive, gruff sound that meant exactly the opposite of dismissal. "Go to Cheyenne," she said. "Come back with your land." The Land Council building on Capitol Avenue was trying very hard to look permanent. Brick, glass windows. A clerk at the entrance, who wore his suit like a man who understood that small authority, held tightly, was still authority. Willa had worn her blue wool dress, the only dress that had survived Wyoming, her hair pinned up properly for the first time since Boston. The canvas duster over everything, because it was cold and because it was hers, and because she had decided the Land Council of Wyoming Territory could accommodate a woman in a work coat. Grove wore his good canvas shirt. His beard was trimmed. She had noticed this at breakfast and said nothing. He had noticed her hair and said nothing. That was its own kind of conversation. Pruitt was already there. Of course he was. He had the clerk. He had the satchel. He had the organized documents of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. He looked at Willa. When she entered, she did not look away first. The council chair, a heavy-set man named Beaumont. White side whiskers, the careful gravity of performed authority called the room to order. Pruitt presented first. Efficient. Precise. Every word true and in service of something that was not. Then Beaumont looked at Grove. Grove stood up. He was not tall. He was the shortest man standing. He was wide and weathered, and his coat didn't quite fit his shoulders, and he had been living alone on a mountain for 14 years. I've been on that land since 1870, he said. Low, no performance. I filed correctly. I built the cabin in the first year. I've paid taxes every year since. I have records. He set the papers on the table, not with flourish. Just put them there. I got married in February because I needed a partner. My wife has been on that mountain since January. She survived a serious injury the first day. She worked through the winter. She is present. He sat down. Beaumont looked at Willa. Mrs. Callum, he said. You wish to speak? She stood, 6'2", in a blue dress and a canvas duster and hair pinned back, calloused hands flat on the table, the hands of a woman who had sorted turnips and mended canvas and pressed pine tar into a wound because there was no one else to do it. She had spent 22 years apologizing for taking up space. She was done with that. My name is Willa Brant Callum, she said. Her voice was level, the full alto that didn't carry apology. I came from Boston in January. I answered an advertisement. I needed a direction and Wyoming was one. A pause. On the day I arrived, I helped move a fallen tree off the trail. A branch went through my right thigh. My husband packed the wound with pine tar to keep it from rotting from the inside. I was feverish for 4 days. He sat beside my bed the entire time. She held Beaumont's eyes. We married on the 9th day, by our own words, over a Bible. There was no witness because we were on a mountain in a blizzard, and there is no one else on that mountain. She let that settle. I know that doesn't satisfy the statute, she said. I know what Mr. Pruitt is arguing is technically correct. The statute says what it says. She looked at Pruitt directly. But I need this counsel to understand what happens when that argument succeeds. Because it has succeeded before. Pruitt shifted, Ned Carrick. She said the room went still. Not silent, still. The particular stillness of people who recognized a name they had hoped wouldn't come up. He was our neighbor for 6 years. He lost his land on a documentation question. He had no family, no money for a lawyer. He died the following February in a rooming house in this city. She looked at the 5 men behind the long table. I am asking you not to do that again. Grove reached into his coat, an envelope, old, the paper soft from handling. He walked to the table and set it in front of Beaumont with both hands. Ned sent me that letter before he died, he said. He wrote down what happened, how Pruitt's man came, what papers they put in front of him, what he signed and what he didn't know he was signing. He looked at Pruitt. I've had it 2 years. I was waiting until I had someone to stand beside me when I used it. He sat down. Pruitt looked at the envelope, the way a man looks at something he believed was buried. Beaumont read. The clerk read over his shoulder. The other council members leaned in. Mr. Pruitt, Beaumont said, not looking up. This letter describes a meeting that names a specific property agent acting on your behalf. You will remain available for further questioning. He set the letter down. Looked at them both. The challenge to the Callum marriage and land claim is denied pending investigation. The Callum claim stands. A pause. Mrs. Callum, your testimony is entered into the record. She sat down. Her hands were shaking. Not fear, not even relief. The physical aftermath of standing at full height in front of a room full of people and saying every true thing she knew and not apologizing for any of it. Grove's hand came to the table beside hers, not holding. Just there. present, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. She turned her hand over. Palm up, his fingers closed. 1 beat. 2, he let go. They walked out into the Cheyenne afternoon. Coal smoke and bread smell, and the noise of a city that didn't know what had just happened on Capitol Avenue. She stopped on the sidewalk, tilted her face up. The sky above Cheyenne was a particular blue, not the bruised purple-gray of the mountain winter, not the flat, threatening lead of a blizzard. A real blue, clear, enormous, the kind of sky that went all the way back. They heard you today, she said. They heard us, he said. She held that word, us. From a man who had used I as his only available pronoun for 14 years. I'm hungry, she said. Something moved in his face. That thing. The shadow of a thing. There's a place on Cary Avenue, he said. Decent steak? Lead the way, she said. He did. They started back the next morning. The road to Laramie. Then the trail up the mountain. 2 days down, 2 days back. The mules had opinions about the return trip. As they always did, but they moved. The mud was softening, deeper in the low places, firmer on the high ground where the sun reached. Willa set a pace, not a slow pace. Not the careful, testing pace of the descent. A real pace. Her limp was there. It was always going to be there. But she'd stopped negotiating with it. It was part of the movement now, part of the rhythm. The walking staff planted. The right leg, the left leg. The staff again. Grove walked beside her. He'd been beside her since the land council. Not behind, not ahead. Beside. She was noticing this. She kept noticing this. And she kept choosing not to say anything about it because some things were better noticed than named. They camped the first night on a flat shelf of granite above the Laramie Valley. The sky went purple and then black and then enormous with stars. The specific, crushing, glorious density of stars that you could only see when there was no city light for 40 miles in any direction. Grove made a fire. She made coffee. They sat on opposite sides of the fire and drank it. She thought about Boston, about the boarding house table, about Patrice's sharp comments and Ruth's arm press in the hallway. She thought about $8 in a tin. She thought about the specific moment when she'd pulled that tin from behind the wash basin. Not afraid, not confident, just decided. She wondered if that's what courage actually was. Not the absence of fear, just decided. What will you do, Grove said, about the women? The fun. She looked at him across the fire. He was doing it again, reading the direction of her thoughts from the set of her face. She was becoming, she realized, legible to him, in a way she had not been legible to anyone she could remember. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She was sure she didn't want it to stop. I'll write them, she said, in the spring. When we have something from the Pelts. She paused. I want to tell them I'm all right, and that if any of them need a direction. She stopped. What? He said. Wyoming is a direction, she said. Something moved through his face. Not the shadow smile. Bigger than that. A warmth that settled somewhere behind his eyes and stayed. There's a trap line that needs a second person, he said. Is that a job offer? It's an observation. She looked at the fire. The eastern boundary, she said. The Carrick Tract, it reverts to the territory now. Pruitt's claim on it collapses with the investigation. He picked up a stick, turned it in his hands. The firelight moved across his face. A person could file on it. A second homestead claim. Properly witnessed this time. She looked at him. You're thinking about another advertisement, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I was thinking, he said carefully, that you might know someone in Boston. Someone who needed a direction. She thought about Ruth, pressing her arm in the hallway. Be careful. Or maybe, be brave. Maybe both. I might, she said. The fire crackled. The stars did what stars do. Remained, she looked at him across the fire. This man she had known for 62 days. This man who had pulled a branch out of her leg without counting to 3. Who had sat on a 3-legged stool for 4 nights while she burned. Who had said the word us in a city street like it was a thing he'd been saving up to say. Grove, she said. He looked up. The coat, she said. He waited. You knew I was staying, she said, before I arrived. You ordered the coat 8 weeks before I arrived, and you told the tailor to make it for work. Not for visiting, not for church. For work, she paused. You'd already decided. He was quiet for a long moment. The stick turned in his hands. I read your letters, he said. All 3 of them, and I read the thing between the lines too. A woman who asked about the winters and the altitude, and whether the water source would run in a dry summer. Not about the house, not about society, about the land. He set the stick down. That's not the letter of a woman who's coming to visit. That's the letter of a woman who's deciding whether a place is worth staying in. Lid. She looked at him. And you thought it was worth staying in? She said. I thought you might think so, he said. If you saw it, she exhaled. Long, slow, the fire, the stars, the sound of the mountain a day's ride above them, waiting. I think so, she said. He looked at her, those gray eyes. In the firelight, they were warmer than she'd seen them. Not soft, he was never going to be soft, but present, fully, completely present. The way stone is present, not asking anything of you. Just there, good, he said. Which was everything. The cabin looked different coming up the trail than it had the first time. Same logs. Same crooked stovepipe. Same window with the thick glass. Same snow on the north-facing roof. The last remnants of winter hanging on in the shadow. But different, because the first time she had seen it as a destination. A fixed point at the end of a terrible journey. A place where the pain might stop, and the cold might stop, and she might get to be still this time. She saw it as something she was returning to. There was a difference. She felt it in her chest. The specific weight of a thing that has shifted from foreign to familiar. Without you noticing the exact moment it happened. Grove pushed open the door. The cabin held its cold. Always did after days without a fire. She went directly to the stove. He went directly to the woodpile. They did not discuss this. It was simply what they each did, as if the division of immediate tasks had been established by the mountain itself. Fire in 15 minutes. She put the kettle on. He hung his coat. She unbuttoned the canvas duster. Hung it on the peg next to his buffalo coat. They hung side by side, hers longer by a foot, his wider by the same. She made coffee. He sat at the table. She sat across from him. They drank it in the growing warmth of the stove's reach, the cold retreating from the corners of the room, the cabin reasserting its character. She looked around at it, the pelts on the walls, the dried herbs, the 3 worn books, the narrow bed that had accommodated 2 people through 3 weeks of winter, the stool beside the bed, still in the position he'd sat it in during the fever. Neither of them had moved it. She'd noticed that. She set her cup down. I need to ask you something, she said. He looked up. The stool, she said. You haven't moved it. He looked at the stool. Then back at her. No, he said. Is that? She stopped. Organized. Is that something you want to talk about? He looked at his cup. He looked at the table. He looked at her. I sat there 4 nights, he said. And it was a pause, long. The kind where she had learned he was choosing very carefully. It was different. From the other nights, he stopped again. I've spent 14 winters on this mountain. On a lot of those nights, I sat in this room alone. And it was... He stopped again. It was sufficient. I told myself it was sufficient. She waited. The nights I sat on that stool, he said, it wasn't sufficient anymore. By itself, he looked at the stool. I didn't want to move it very far from where it had been. She looked at this man. This man who had refused to find a reason she was important for 3 months. Because he didn't have the language for it and wouldn't offer her cheap words when he wasn't sure of expensive ones. She stood up. She picked up her stool, carried it around the table, set it beside his chair. She sat down. They were side by side now, shoulders almost touching. Looking at the stove together. He looked at her. She looked at the stove. This is purely practical, she said. It's warmer on this side. A pause. Correct, he said. She breathed, he breathed. The fire talked to itself in the stove. The mountain held the cabin in its hands. The spring ran somewhere below them, all that winter finally releasing, finding its way down. She was not in Boston. She was not in a boarding house dining room. She was not at a loom. She was not standing in front of a man named Farnsworth being looked at and found too large. She was in a cabin on a mountain in Wyoming, sitting beside a man who had ordered her a coat before she arrived, who had sat beside her bed for 4 nights, who had pulled a branch from her leg without counting to 3, because counting doesn't change what's coming, and she'd had enough in her life of people pretending otherwise. His shoulder touched hers. She didn't move away. He didn't move away. Outside, the meltwater was running again, the whole mountain letting go. All that held an accumulated weight of winter, moving at last, downhill. Finding the creek, finding the valley, finding wherever water goes when winter is finally finished with it. She thought about the 7 women at Mrs. Galvin's table. She was going to write those letters. All of them. Ruth first. She was going to describe the mountain, the altitude, and the winters, and the water source that ran even in a dry summer. She was going to describe the cabin next door, the Carrick track, the land that needed someone to file on it. She was going to describe Wyoming exactly as it was. Cold, brutal, enormous, requiring everything you had, and then some things you didn't know you had until it needed them. She was going to describe it as worth it, because it was. Because she was sitting in a one-room cabin on the side of a mountain in the first week of spring, shoulder to shoulder with the most undemonstrative man she had ever met, who had nonetheless demonstrated more than anyone she could name. And that was the whole truth of it. The transaction was done. What was left didn't have a word, but it was there. The scar on her thigh would ache when the weather changed. It already did. She'd learned to read it like a barometer. Low pressure coming. Storm 3 days out. Time to bring the mules in. She was going to carry that weather reading for the rest of her life, on this land. That was enough, chef. She picked up her caw. He picked up his. The fire in the stove had found its rhythm. The particular, settled sound of a fire that has been burning long enough to know what it's doing.